Bonnie Morgan holds Bachelor of Laws and Master of Information and Library Science degrees from Dalhousie University and a doctorate in history from the University of New Brunswick. Prior to that, she earned honors Bachelor and Master of Arts degrees from Memorial University. Morgan's work on the history of religion can be found in Canadian Women Shaping Diasporic Religiosities from Wilfrid Laurier University, which was published in 2016, and Making This Place, Class, Gender, and Family in 20th Century St. John's, Newfoundland, which is a McGill-Queen's publication published in 2014. While studying at Dalhousie, she co-authored a work called The Sentinel on the Street, St. Matthew United Church, Halifax, 1749 to 1999, which was published by Nimbus in 1999. Her most recent work, Ordinary Saints, Women, Work, and Faith in Newfoundland, was published by McGill-Queen's in 2019 and won the Canadian Historical Association 2020 Atlantic Clio Prize, was shortlisted for the 2020 Heritage and History Book Awards by the Historic Sites Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, and long-listed for the 2020 Newfoundland Labrador Nonfiction Book Award. Morgan currently works as Director of Library Operations for the Newfoundland and Labrador Public Libraries. I now pass the evening over to Bonnie Morgan and a presentation, as you can see on your screen, Immortal, Invisible, Finding Evidence of Spirituality and Faithfulness in the History of Lived Religion. Bonnie? Bonnie, you have to, you're on mute. You're on mute, Bonnie. You have to take yourself off mute. There you go. Go ahead.
I tried to unmute myself earlier and it said, okay, you're not allowed. I thought that Leah would do it automatically, so my apologies.
Oh, that's okay.
It's very unusual to be presenting a lecture in this format. It's the energy that you get from the audience is so important, I find, for public speaking. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that the executive of the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society invited me to present this lecture. And it's a wonderful break for me from my administrative responsibilities in my day-to-day work. So thank you again for this opportunity. So tonight's lecture is, I wanted to present a bit about the method and the motivations behind the writing of Ordinary Saints. So I wanted to provide some background on my doctoral work and how this project was first envisioned during my time at Memorial. I want to present my principal findings and also what methodologies I used and what they contributed to the study. Because as my title says, Immortal, Invisible, looking for spirituality and faithfulness, as those of you who've studied your catechism know, looking for outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual graces, how to find evidence of spirituality and how I use diverse methodologies to do that. As I go through, there's pictures that you'll see that are part of the slides. I won't always stop and explain those pictures, but they are largely photographs of informants, so women that I interviewed in the course of the research for this book, pictures taken in those women's homes during the interviews of objects and pictures they owned or textiles they created. and also some pictures I took while exploring what I call my treasure chests. So that will become evident as I work my way through the presentation. So this book was based on my doctoral dissertation. So the manuscript came from my work I did at University of New Brunswick under the supervision of Dr. Linda Keeley. And the title of the original work, Conceiving Christianity, Women and Lived Religion in Mid-20th Century Conception Bay, Newfoundland. So for those of you who are possibly doing graduate work or interested in the more in-depth academic material that's in the doctoral dissertation, that is where it can be found. So when I started my work on my doctorate, lived religion was really a new area of study. It was something that I actually discovered very early in my doctoral studies. My original proposal spoke of popular religion, of folk religion, and this was something that I discovered and became very interested in as a part of that research. So the purpose of the study, as I began it, was I wanted to understand the lived religious beliefs and practices, what I call theological culture, of ordinary Christian women. So theology is something that we tend to think of as an academic discipline, a male-dominated discipline historically, not so much anymore. But for me, theology is any thinking about God and humanity's relationship to that God, how one can be in relationship with your understanding of who or what God is. So for me, ordinary Christian women, they're thinking about those relationships, and the divine was an important part of what I wanted to understand and how they express that in their everyday lives. The other thing that was really interesting and important to me was to understand that interplay of social relationships, material conditions, and faithfulness within households and communities of rural Newfoundland. And for me, just to go back to the social relationships, as we often, relationships of class, of gender, for example, one thing that I discovered early in my studies that became really important to me was the work of Robert Orsi. And some of you may remember that Dr. Orsi was here for the Henrietta Harvey lecture a few years ago. And he spoke about the importance of the social relationship with spiritual figures, so that the relationship that a person understands they may have with a saint or another figure, if it shapes their agency and how they live in this world, then it's an important relationship for understanding in terms of social relationships. And that was something that made a real impact on me as I began my work. The other thing that was really important to me was to expand the existing scholarship of women, work, and religion that I was seeing while I was doing my graduate work, my master's level work in the mid-1990s. And as some of you may know, I did my master's at Memorial, and under the supervisorship of Dr. Jim Hiller. And that was a really positive experience working with Dr. Hiller. And what I discovered while I was working on that was that the literature tended to be very dominated by the experience, especially women in religion, of the whole missionary experience of middle-class women in association and as a stepping stone to larger public roles. So the church association as a springboard, so to speak, for public roles and that sort of thing. So it was a kind of stepping stone to independence. Working class religion was starting to become important at that time. There's the work of Lynn Marks that was emerging then. And that was something that I became very interested in. And the fact that for this idea that traditionally that working people were disinterested in religion. They didn't have that same engagement as middle class or elite peoples. And from my own experience and my own understanding from just my own growing up and experience within a working class household, that was not quite accurate. And I just wanted to explore that in my work. The other thing was that this idea that, again, that there was a story to be told about the relationship between work and religion, and that was untold. That there was, again, from my own experience, I was surrounded by women who worked hard supporting their church, and I was interested in household labor in and of itself. And there was this realization, household labor and women's work is important, but it was also a way for women to express faithfulness. And that was the big question that came to my mind in the mid-90s. And it was 15 years later that I actually began the doctoral work. My 40th birthday present to myself was starting my doctorate. So that's the sort of background for that. So when I was going through, and I just want to go over a few of the findings briefly, is I found that in the course of the research, the interplay that there did exist between religion and labor, and especially that women's spirituality and the religious influence that they had was tied to the practice of household labor in the family economy. So within the literature, not prescribed gender expectations. So within the literature, I found these two schools of thought about the patriarchal piety, so that women's religious belief and practice and in the home was informed by this idea of authority running from God the Father to the father in the family. There was also then this idea of Christian womanhood, which was again a very prescribed idea about how to be a woman of faith that was very much tied to her role within the household. And this was something I actually found did not apply to the women that I studied. The other thing that I discovered was that religious belief really informed the understanding of the value of women's labor. So we have studied and we're aware of the economic value of women's labor and the contribution in those ways, but also a different sense of the value of women's labor that went beyond the sort of economic and social value of it in terms of it contributing to, a household or community or the economy, to how it was informed and was and made valuable through religion as well. And finally, that work was a way for women to develop and express their faithfulness. The other thing that came across in the study that I discovered, and again, trying to understand the evidence that was before me, I found this concept of the feminist theological culture that was in some of the British literature. And what was really important to me was expanding the idea that there could be a feminist theological culture outside the middle class and the elites. Because everything I had read focused on, it tended to be women of privilege, women in particular social standing, the impacts they made, the journals, the letters that they left behind to understand this theological culture. And for me, and again, as we come to the methods and that I used, I wanted to expand that beyond just middle class and elites, the ordinary woman who did not leave records behind, who didn't leave journals, who didn't leave large bodies of letter, who didn't make a huge splash, maybe socially in a larger kind of frame, but how her understanding of God and her relationship to that God and people's relationship could be expressed in a way that was really tied to a feminist culture. So as I worked through women's their beliefs and their understanding and expressions, I found some patterns. And one was that there was a real resistance to patriarchal authority that ran through the evidence that I was seeing. There was also, and that was expressed largely, it came out in the interviews, and it also came out a great deal in the Church of England Women's Association record books that I used. There was also a sense of personal relationship with the divine. And this, again, with interviews and material culture, was revealed. I also found there was a Christian duty to care for each other, not the other. And that's another, again, this point about the middle class experience and the dominant idea in the literature of religion being a way for women to, interact with the other, the people who are maybe not as wealthy or as high social standing, who need to be, quote unquote, improved in terms of their lives. And instead of that, I saw a care for each other as a way of expressing religion, so a mutuality. There was also a negotiation of gender roles that I found within the household, and when it came to issues of religion. Or matters of religious expression. So things like who brought children to church. This stood in contrast to the dominant literature of it was women who cared about religion and took children to church. And in the case of my study area, men would take children to church, men would lead prayer services, but yet women were involved in other aspects of the household, that, for example, their Sabbath being preserved as well as a male Sabbath. And then there was the point about the shared religious authority. So that in some cases, for example, family prayer, you'd see it largely led by men. But when it came to determining what direction the family would go into in terms of issues of conversion or religious experimentation, it was women who often led the family. So it was a shared authority there and a respect for female religious authority in the communities that I think was really worth noting. And then, so this idea, what I call lived feminism, we study lived religion. This I see as well as a kind of lived feminism. I don't think any woman who I interviewed would identify herself as a feminist, but the feminist culture certainly came across in their words and their actions. The last point I want to make in terms of the findings with the study was the impact of modernization. So many of you, of course, involved in this association understand in post-Confederation Newfoundland this kind of push for modernization of the economy, of the fishery, society. We see it even expressed in architecture. And this sense of the modern, this transition from the family traditional economy to the household economy, to the wage economy, a growth in consumer culture. This impacted women's sense of their religious identity and their authority. And I think really it came down to, in the household economy, women's labor was so valuable economically, and there was a recognition of that. But with a change to a wage economy, I wonder, I sort of get a sense that women did not want to lose the sense that their work was important, that it was significant. And one way of making your work significant was to use it in terms of your church community. And part of this was there was increased financial demands from clergy as the church became a modern church, a more professional church. And we see this in women's thinking as you look at that CWA model. Those of you who've read my book understand this language of sisters. So the sisterhood, the CWA, they were sisters. Then all of a sudden you have your ACW by the mid-1960s, and they're not sisters anymore, they're ladies. So they're the ladies of the ACW. The ladies gathered rather than the sisters gathered. And I just think that's a really interesting change in language that moved from sisters to ladies. But despite that, we do see a continued resistance to patriarchal power in the lives of women, in their religious lives. So this brings me back to motivations. As I was doing, and just to go back to my master's degree, as I was reading the research and reading minute books, that research was on St. Thomas's Anglican parish and St. Mary the Virgin, which was on the south side for the era that I studied. I just kept the sense that there was someone missing from the stories that I was reading. As I read the academic research, someone is missing. And that someone, those people were the women who surrounded me. And I wrote about that a bit in the preface of Ordinary Saints, that I grew up surrounded by women and in relationship with women in the community, within my own family, who were deeply spiritual people, who took their religion very seriously, and who worked really hard for their church, and the church was important to them. And I wanted to tell that story. I felt it was an important story that needed to be told, that there was agency there, that there was importance to that I was not seeing in the existing literature. And just to briefly, this picture is one of my informants. She was actually my Aunt Eileen, who passed away 7 years ago. And the picture next to it is, I just put that there because it says just a hello, but it was in the women's, the CWA records, sisterly is written in there. So just a sisterly hello. And I think that speaks to the mindset of the women who are in organization together. While I'm on this page, and I have that card in front of me, how this sort of all started in terms of this particular area and this particular study is with volunteer work with my local parish. So many of you are active with anniversary committees or community-based history projects as, you know, amateur historians. And when I was involved with the 100th anniversary committee of my local parish, part of that work on that committee, I discovered these records. I discovered these records of women that were there in the parish hall. And when I saw those in 2004, 2005, I knew there was something wonderful there. I knew there was a story there. I knew there was something important and that was there. When I opened that first record and saw 1926 as the date in handwriting from Seal Cove and read some of those minute book entries, I saw the significance of what was there from my background as an historian, and wanted to tell that story. What I also knew from growing up in this community of faithful women and in a community where the church and the expressing of religion was really important was how complex lived faithfulness is. So things that were separate specialties of academic study, were actually, for me, in my own experience and understanding, actually really interconnected. There was potential connections between different ways of being faithful and expressing faith. So this various patchwork, as I like to think of it, and again, this is a lovely textile that it's a woman's home. So there was one aspect of women's expressed faithfulness was the interpretation and application of official doctrine. So when women sit in a pew in their church and they hear the service, they hear what's being said, how they interpret that, how they adapt it and apply it in their lives is just one aspect of that lived faithfulness. Then another aspect that I saw and understood that I was curious about was then how you express faithfulness through participating in the church or being activist in the church. So being involved in organizations or not. And that was something that was important to me as I did my interviews. I didn't want to just interview women who were, our church stalwarts, people who I knew or were active in their church, that were regular attendees at formal worship, at public worship, but also the women who were not, because that is another way of being Anglican. That's another way of being faithful that is separate from being active in the church. So that was something else I wanted to explore. A third complexity of lived faithfulness is what can be labeled folk or popular traditions. And this is sometimes used disparagingly, traditionally, when you'd see some clergy especially would be very dismissive of a popular belief, and because it was not as important or not as significant or not as real or as doctrine or dogma from the official church. And there's one example I can think of from Ordinary Saints of a woman who said she was very curious about this idea of not using scissors on a Sunday, and how this was something she grew up with. And she asked her priest about it, and he just kind of laughed and dismissed it as foolishness. But for her, she was serious. This was something that was part of her faith, was that she shouldn't use scissors. She wanted to understand that. She didn't want it dismissed. So again, this was all part of what I see as the faithfulness of women. Then there's the embodied religion, kneeling to pray, folding your hands to pray. That's just one example of embodied. The whole faith healing, being healed through a sense of connection to the divine, having that personal interaction where, a divine power can heal you. And also embodied religion is that sense of the body as temple, embodied faith, and it's especially associated with the holiness movement. So traditions that believe in the sanctity of the body, that you don't, particular activities, dancing or eating certain foods, corrupt the essential, divinity of the self. And then a final aspect that I saw and wanted to explore as a way, again, I saw it around me, I wanted to understand it, was visual and sensory piety. So this is the objects people have in their homes, the crucifix, the Sacred Heart, the prayer card, the Sunday school diploma, all these things, the Bible, the images of Christ as Good Shepherd. To understand having these things in the home and the impact they had on spirituality, and also what they reflected in terms of women's understanding of God and their relationship to that God. So material religion is another way that's expressed. So again, all different threads in the academic literature, but I saw them all coming together in the lived faithfulness of this particular community. So complex. How do you understand something so complex? And this goes to the use of microhistory. So I've just put a map there, and the study area for this work is basically from Seal Cove to Foxtrot, something you can drive now in a car in 10-15 minutes. Although, as one of my informants pointed out, who lived in Upper Gullies, Kelligrews was a long ways away in those days. But again, I used microhistory so I could go deep, because I understood spirituality to be a very deep, complex thing. Rather than going wide and looking for comparative studies, I wanted to go deep. And I did consider doing comparative, of finding another part of the province to do, to compare work with. But then I realized that I wasn't aiming for universal conclusions or demonstrating what practices were most common or more important or more widespread. I wanted to understand how complex women's faith could be. And by limiting the scope and going deep, I could uncover these distinctive and detailed patterns. And a big goal for me, and why I wanted to, as I will get later, the methodology, I never understood this work to be universal findings about what working rural women's religion was. I wanted to kind of set an example for others who may want to explore their own communities and how they could get at it, how they could find out what was important and significant for the people around them and their communities. But that being said, I have got a lot of feedback since Ordinary Saints came out, even from across Canada, that a lot of the patterns and things that I describe or discovered through my work in Ordinary Saints are recognizable to other people from their own background and own experience across denominations, across communities in Newfoundland, and even in communities across Canada and rural communities. So, so that's been interesting, since this is something that I kind of didn't set out to do. The other thing with microhistory, and I want to give a nod to Linda Cullum, who before I started my work, I had met with Linda and to talk about what I was planning to do and wanted to do in terms of my study. And I was telling her about this wonderful collection of records that I had found while working on the 100th anniversary committee, and how they, they totally turned me on. There was so much there to say about women's history and these unknown records, these unstudied records, and this story that needed to be told. And she's like, why not do that? I'm like, why not? So, so thank you to Linda, who set me on that path and recognized what I was doing in terms of a microhistory was actually worth doing and significant. Okay, just trying to get my slide to advance. Here we go. So the study area, why that time and place? I've already talked about some of the personal motivations, some of the practical motivations, the curiosity and those records that I found. But there was other reasons besides that that I felt that it was worth looking at this particular area. And one thing was seeing the traditional economy, the family economy, that was in transition to a wage economy. And that's something that was kind of special in terms of my own background, because I'd read a lot of work on the 19th century while doing my master's. And it was sort of a unique opportunity because this sort of transition happened outside the scope of living memory in many jurisdictions. But here in Newfoundland, it was happening within the living memory of people that were in the community. So it was a way to look at that transition and its impact, and to interview people to get their personal perceptions of it. It's also the division of labor, sexual division of labor in rural Newfoundland, and this recognition of the indoor-outdoor work, that, foundational work that's being done that was very useful and very important to what I was doing. And this concept that women worked harder than the men, that women's labor was really important in the communities. And also, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of the need to modernize Newfoundland, which included the church, and again, to be able to study that and have living memory and be able to talk to people about that in a really personal way that documents don't always capture. And finally, my personal connections. And this posed its own challenges. So autoethnography, studying your own community, people around you, there's benefits. Definitely benefits to that in terms of being an insider and being people opening up to you and getting access. And that was very gratifying and useful, but there's challenges to it as well. And I always say you have to be so careful. I think I second guessed myself so much because I always had to stop and think, is this just your impression? Go back to the evidence. My view could be a stepping stone. It could be a way to be a launching pad into a line of inquiry. But I was also very mindful that I needed to have a bit of separation as well to make sure that what I was finding and what I was concluding was based in what I was hearing, what I was seeing, even though the personal impression could be a starting point. It could be it just meant I felt I had to be extra rigorous in what I was doing and extra careful. I don't think there's such thing as subjectivity in any study. We all bring ourselves to what we do, but in my case, given what I was doing, I felt a need to be really extra careful with what I was doing and what I was considering as I worked my way through the evidence. So now I just want to come to the sort of methodology part of this presentation, of this lecture. And again, as I said, I understood I was doing something to kind of set an example of how to do it. This is how you do it. As an example for other people who may be wanting to do a study like this. So the various methodologies, I'm going to speak to each one in turn, but there were published records, so our published primary resources. So the primary one for me was the Diocesan Magazine, which was the official Anglican publication of the church in Newfoundland and Labrador, which I loved when I saw this, renamed the Newfoundland Churchman in 1959. So we went from a gender-neutral diocesan magazine to the modern church, which was men, in 1959. So I thought that was kind of enlightening in and of itself. And then I also had manuscript records. Primarily for me, it was Church of England Women's Association records. And that was the primary women's organization of the Church of England in Newfoundland, on the East Coast especially, up until the change over to the Anglican Church Women and the Anglican Women's Association, one after the other in the 1960s. The other thing I used was material history, material culture, I should say. So material objects, especially religious pictures and objects, and also headstones. So that was an important part of what I wanted to do as well. Then there were the oral interviews. I did a lot of work in the Mon Folklore and Language Archives. And I also used the nominal census of Newfoundland from 2135 and 1945 in the work. And I have a quote here from Sarah Williams, who is a British cultural historian. And she talked about the need to use diverse methods to fully appreciate the local, the denominational, and the class-specific forms that religion took. And really that sums up, I think, a lot of what my study was about and why I chose the approach I did. Local, denominational, class specific, and to appreciate how complex religion can be. So Sarah Williams, she's working now at Regent College, associated with the University of British Columbia, and doing some really fascinating work now on the historical imagination and prayer and awareness of time. So how when one prays, you're bringing past, present, and future all together in that moment in your head, but I digress. Really exciting and interesting work for the people interested in the study of religion. So I want to start by the published primary documents. So your diocesan magazine. So that was primarily used in this study to understand the official Anglican perspective. A perspective that was usually middle class, usually male, and usually clerical. And the contents, it helped me understand, and it would help you understand relationships with other traditions, traditions such as Jehovah's Witnesses, Roman Catholics, Pentecostals, Salvationists, so different traditions, and what Anglican relationship was with them, or the official church's perspective on that. Also an understanding of the sacraments, so baptism, burial ritual, what was expected, what the Eucharist, what was expected, what was the expectations for laity, I should say. So Lent keeping, what makes a Christian life from a clerical perspective, to understand that in order to understand women's reactions to it. So you need to me, I felt I needed to understand that, to understand how women interpreted and applied it to their own life. It was especially useful for understanding that desire for modernization that developed in the church, and also the impact of domestic ideology. So you see this change of like the modern church woman and the family religion that came in that 1950s era, and that came across in the pages of the diocesan magazine, and how the church, the official church, the institutional church, was embracing that as a good model for a Christian life. The published diocesan magazine was also really useful for finding obituaries of women and understanding that culture of suffering, which, if you're familiar with my work, I explore somewhat. So how women and their deaths, good deaths, bad deaths, the meaning of suffering as a means of salvation, and who suffered, and women's suffering as especially in the official record being a means to salvation. It also let me see local priorities in terms of parishes and missions, and CWA news. So occasionally women would write pieces, especially at the diocesan or the district level, about what was going on with the CWA. Then my treasure chest, and here is a picture of one of my treasure chests. So these were the unpublished manuscript records that I discovered while working on that anniversary committee. So there's parish registers are part of this. So your birth, marriage, your death registers, your service registers, so what services are being held, your vestry book, and your vestry and annual meetings in terms of priorities. And so those were important. But also, and then also important, very important, were the CWA association records. So these were minute books and account books, and as well as the Anglican Church women records. So here you see one of the trunks, both at St. Peter's in Upper Gullies and at All Saints in Foxtrap. There were trunks that looked almost exactly the same, that held almost exactly the same things. So they were found with pieces of fabric, with rolls of trim. There were playing cards, there were bingo cards, there were gavels, Bibles, service books, all together in these trunks. And in the picture there, you can see in the right hand, the little stack with the black book on top. There are the records nestled in with everything else. And I wrote endangered species there. The reason it's an endangered species is when I went to Foxtrap and found the records, there were Long Pond records, there were no Foxtrap records. I asked one of the women, she said, oh, we were tidying up one day and they were just, someone said, we don't want this old junk, and they threw them out. So, endangered species. When it only takes, when records are like this in communities, it only takes one person with time on their hands wanting to tidy up their room to lose a vital piece of our history of our underrepresented working and rural women. So it's something that I feel keenly, because the Seal Cove record survived, the Long Pond record survived, a couple of the Foxtrap records survived and the Upper Gullies ones, but some were gone forever. And it only takes a moment. These records are so important because it reflects their rituals and their priorities, their relationships to each other, and also their resistance. I'm just going to change over to the next slide while I speak for a moment. This is something that I discovered while doing my master's, and I wanted to apply it. This is part of my motivation for the doctoral work in this study. When I was doing my master's, I was sort of in a different mind space when I was looking at the records of the church women. I was going through and I'd open up a minute book and it'd be like flipping, like looking through, and it'd be like prayers, 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 prayers. What are they knitting? What are they sewing? Trying to find, quote unquote, what was important. Looking for comments on poverty, looking for comments on the political life, looking for those sorts of what I was bringing in terms of my own lens of sifting out what was important. I had then a moment while doing that work when I realized if 95% of what these women wrote in this book is about their prayers and who was sick and what they're sewing, what they're knitting, their tea, what their teas, their relationships with each other. That's what's important. It's what's important for them. It was their priority. So that for me was what I wanted to bring, that new awareness of how to bring myself as the historian to those records in a really respectful way. So here are a few more shots of, so there's the trunk with the cover on it. When I first opened it, you can see the Crown exercise book there. Seal Cove, CWA records in that one, notes. There's some, there are gavels and a Woolco bag. And there's a minute book that's opened. And in between the pages, I found this little slip of fabric. So a little sample that was there, preserved, that spoke to the importance of textile making and textiles as a way of expressing religiosity. And that, of course, formed a full chapter of Ordinary Saints because it was so important to these women. So the next thing that was really important was the informant interviews, and getting at that very deeply personal in a way that documents don't always capture oral history is so important. And again, this was so time sensitive. I had a conversation again when I was thinking about doing my doctorate and what I may write about. I met with Diane Ty and I told her what I was thinking about. And she said, I usually don't say this, but you get going on that, because the women whose stories I was interested in were aging. And I interviewed 22 women. I think only 10 of them are still living, just, a few years later. So it was an experience and a moment in time, that kind of wage economy emerging, that consumer culture emerging, the changing church, that I wanted to capture their impressions of. And also where religion was so important in the household as well. So again, oral history and the use of material culture recognizes that many ordinary believers, and especially rural women, don't produce written records. So expanding our understanding and creating a place for that women's experience, for those women, and to recognize their agency and their impact and what was important to them, I wanted to use the oral history methodology. The interviews were really good for understanding sort of personal impressions, but also household rituals were revealed that way, devotional practices around food, what you ate on Good Friday and what you didn't eat, your prayer, how your family practiced prayer when you were growing up versus what you did in your own family, the experience of churching, which is, a particular ritual or within the Anglican Church that was important for women at that time, the churching of women after childbirth, and a very complex history around that and understanding of what it meant, and seeing how different women perceived that ritual of churching, and also healing practices. It also was a way for me to understand sort of sense of spiritual authority and how piety and lived piety was more important than official authority for these women when they saw someone as a spiritual role model, and just their personal beliefs and perspectives that you're not going to get in the written word. It was also valuable for understanding relationships with other traditions beyond the official record. So that's where you find things like closer relationships with Roman Catholic neighbors than the denominational kind of interpretation of Newfoundland history might suggest, but also a kind of more animosity towards a kind of vital, dynamic, holiness-based tradition, such as Pentecostalism. And doing these interviews informed my writing, because when I was writing my thesis and later Ordinary Saints, a huge thing for me was wanting to write a history that they could engage with. I didn't want it to be inaccessible. I wanted to be academically sound, but accessible to the women whose stories I was telling and whose voices I was trying to honor throughout that work. The religious prints and objects were great for revealing the unwritten and the unsaid. So these were pictures that people had in their homes. They were very much revealed. A sense of personal relationship with Christ was revealed. The denominational insights that were revealed when you see sort of Sacred Hearts and Marian imagery that was associated with Roman Catholicism in the literature in Anglican homes. Was, I think, really interesting and important. And the pastoral images, the attraction to a particular type of image. And what was also significant was what was not there. So again, if you read Ordinary Saints, the types of representations of the others, the kind of representations of a muscular Christianity, that they did exist, but they were not preserved and displayed in the homes of these women. And I think the fact that they weren't displayed, they weren't extant, they didn't survive, speaks to the devotional life and the spiritual life of the women. Another big part of finding the stories and trying to explore the spirituality, the invisible, the immortal, and trying to find evidence of that was in headstones and epitaphs. So I surveyed headstones, almost 500 in local cemeteries, headstones that were erected in this era from 1920 to roughly 1970. And because I felt that these headstones, they weren't just one-offs, they weren't just, oh, people selected these. These were permanent markers to people who others loved. They weren't just, it wasn't just accidental what was selected. What was selected for headstones was significant. What was selected for women, what was selected by women. Those were important differences. And I wanted to understand what we could learn about belief, especially concepts of heaven, the hereafter, of Christian consolation in what was written on headstones. So you get from a cemetery landscape like this represents an equality. You can see almost every headstone is the same. There isn't that kind of class distinction there. You also get gender relation insights. And from the cemeteries in the study area, you'd see domesticated heaven is rejected, this idea that earthly relationships, the domestic home is an eternal connection. You don't see, Mildred, wife of Samuel, and Samuel's headstone. It's Samuel, husband of. It's Mildred, wife of. There was not that was identified in the literature, in other cemeteries and other jurisdictions, that the wife of, the sense of ownership that was revealed on headstones, or a kind of imbalance in patriarchal relationship, was not there. There was other aspects I didn't get to study about the imagery on headstones and the clasped hands. I'm not going to go down that road, but it's fascinating if someone can do it. One thing that came across in these epitaphs was this idea of women labored and men suffered. So any headstones that spoke about work and labor often were for women. Epitaphs that referenced suffering and release from suffering were often put up for men. So we have these sort of orthodox beliefs that were on headstones, images of rest and peace, heaven as home, lost love, and also of remembrance. So this was the headstones, the epitaphs were also a way of understanding spirituality in the absence of a written record and getting at a different aspect of lived faithfulness. Then there was the Mun Folklore and Language Archives. So many of you may be familiar with this collection. There's student papers, there's recordings, there's transcripts. So I read or listened to everything from the study area. And one thing that I'd say is important is to actually read transcripts and listen to the interviews. Because often when people, again, when I go back to my own kind of idea of what's important, a student paper, what may be emphasized in a paper, there was spiritual evidence that was ignored, whether because of secular perspectives or I'm not sure why, but to go back and actually listen to the interviews, there was evidence of spirituality, there was religious content that wasn't always captured in the interpretation of that record by other people. So again, that's there. So the Folklore and Language Archives, foodways was very important. Death rituals were found, childbirth. There was a lot of work done on midwifery. Janet McNaughton did a lot of research on midwives. So to listen to the interviews with midwives from the from the area and find the religious content in that, and also just to understand the social and economic context of the time. And another thing for me is to hear voices long dead, to hear interviews, recordings, transcripts from times from the early 70s, the mid 70s, people who were no longer with us, but to also get their insights, which was really important for the earlier parts of the study, so the 1920s and the 1930s, when a lot of the women that I interviewed would have just been small children in some cases. Sometimes they were in their 20s. I interviewed 2 people who were nearing their 100th birthdays. But it was a way to hear voices long dead and discover previously overlooked spiritual content. The nominal census of Newfoundland. Aren't Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, especially Newfoundlanders, blessed with having a nominal census for these years? So I want to say a shout out to the Newfoundland Labrador Statistics Agency, who I called them up, told them about my study. I was speaking to Terry Quinlan over there, and he was able to provide me with spreadsheets of the census records, which allowed me to do a really in-depth analysis of the women and their families, and to make them not just names in a minute book, to find out more about their lives. I could trace it across time. So I looked at households of activist women and looked at the patterns there. I was able to trace households across time. A huge thing that came across in looking at the nominal census and being able to do that microhistory deep study was the degree of religious experimentation. Of an Anglican family in 1921 is Pentecostal in 1935, could be Anglican again in 1945. Salvation Army to Anglican. Anglican Salvation Army stayed Salvationist. Just to see, but the experimentation was something that was very interesting to me, because it showed this idea of, you're lifelong Anglican, you're loyal Anglican. That was not necessarily the case. There was a lot of experimentation with belief systems. Female spiritual authority also came through in this record, because as I found and is revealed in the discussion in Ordinary Saints, is women tended to lead how a household went in terms of religion. So in one case, there was a household where the mother, it was an Anglican household. They were identified as Pentecostal in 1935, and then between 1935 and 1945, the son in the household married an activist Anglican woman from, I think she was from Foxtrot or Lawn Pond, I'm not 100% sure, and they're Anglican, and they're solidly Anglican. And they're a household that I, as someone who grew up in the community, would have seen as a, hardcore Anglican family, but, they flirted with Pentecostalism. It was something that they were interested in, they found meaningful at that time, but the fact that a woman who was very activist and committed, they were Anglican once again. So to show that kind of religious authority of women. So I have a couple of pictures there from, I have to mention the Sunday school attendance record is an example of an Anglican family that I interviewed, and it's a Pentecostal Sunday school record that they had in their family Bible, and they only attended twice. So there's 2 stars, they went twice. So don't think that years ago everyone went to church every Sunday in Sunday school, every week, because they didn't always do that. So just to conclude, the essence of what I discovered and wanted to express in Ordinary Saints. In 20th century Conception Bay, Anglicans, women's spiritual lives were tied to their working lives. So the work they did and the way they expressed their faith was very closely intertwined. Participation in the family economy informed gender relationships, which in turn shaped their religious belief and practices. I found that women demonstrated neither a commitment to Christian motherhood nor the embrace of patriarchal piety. That would have been expected from the existing literature. Instead, what I found was a theological culture that demonstrated a feminist theological consciousness. And that was a consciousness that was marked by a resistance to patriarchal authority, a sense of mutuality, and also the negotiation of gender roles. And the last picture I will speak to, so there's a game of cards by an activist family that was shared with me. And the woman with the sweater over her shoulders is the midwife, Dorcas Taylor, Aunt Dark. And so I thought that I would put that in there. It's one that was not in Ordinary Saints, but I think it's a fantastic picture. So thank you for listening. And I just wanted to tell you that, so this slide, the McGill Queen's University Press was in contact with me earlier this week, and there's a discount code, MQFA. So anyone who attends this lecture, if you go on and order a copy of my book prior to the end of October, so in the month of October, it's eligible for a 30% discount with that code MQFA. So thank you very much to McGill Queens for offering that to you, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. You can hear me, can you?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. That was most interesting, particularly your emphasis on oral history, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions about that. So we now have an opportunity for people to either ask questions through the chat line or to use the raised hand function, and Leah Griffith will be either reading the comments on the chat line or acknowledging people who are raising their hands. She'll be managing that. So if there's anybody that has a question, by all means, put your hand up. I'm going to ask a question right off the bat. When we were doing, there's Joan Ritchie. Leah, do you want to acknowledge Joan there? I'll ask my question later.
Yes, okay, so go ahead, Joan.
Joan, you're still on mute.
She is, yeah, there you go. Yep.
You're still on mute, Joan.
Sorry, I thought you were going to control that. Okay, thank you. Yes, I am. You can hear me now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Bonnie. I really enjoyed it. I think you're a very good teacher. You really went through the methodology so well. It was crystal clear. I could really see the depth to which you went. So neat. You know, and I grew up in Newfoundland too, and I can just hear what you're describing and what you found too, aside from the academic side, was just so interesting. I had a question in your book. What I found was not so much, you didn't really go into if there were conflicts between the women. Like I know you mentioned there'd be some competition, say between who had a nicer looking tea table and things. But you know, when I think of the women's group, sometimes I remember my aunts would say two women were like oil and water, you know, you couldn't have them together on a project or anything like that. Did you encounter, or were they all very sweet and religious ladies?
I wouldn't say that. There were some conflicts. I mean, I think that I tried to represent that with the basically the I think the Effie Morgan experience, that her kind of background and how she became alienated from the community because she was not accepted, she was gossiped about, she felt rejected and ostracized by the women in Seal Cove. So I did try to capture that somewhat. It didn't come across, and maybe again, that was a shadow side of being an insider, is that no one wanted to say negative things about each other. And I didn't hear it I just didn't hear that much throughout the interviews, that there were those kinds of rivalries. I don't know. I mean, that would be interesting for someone to be looking in, to kind of look at that aspect, I think, because of course, it wasn't perfect. It's like the whole idea of, there was shadows in all of these women's lives. There was, some stories of, domestic violence that I asked questions about particular headstones and I was told stories. Oh, that was a woman who her and her son were killed by her husband. And there was that reality that was there, but it was not the primary purpose of what I was trying to, I think, communicate here. But yeah, I suspect there was. It was just not communicated to me, and there was not a whole lot of evidence of it.
Yes, and I can understand because it's what you found in the records and what was important to them you were bringing out. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I didn't ask the question. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, when I went through, I didn't say, everyone get along? Maybe then I would have gotten evidence of that. So perhaps that was a kind of gap in my own approach that someone else who was studying a community of women maybe could fill that gap by asking that question. And it's an important question to ask. So I think that's an important point you're making.
Oh, Bonnie, we were going to go back to, you were going to stop sharing your screen so we could see the other people that were attending the lecture. Ah, good. Well, we see some people, at least we see their names. Leah, do you want to handle another person?
So Joan Hotson asks, did you get a sense of the role of the parochial school system and whether it contributed to the segregation of religious adherents?
Yes, officially. That's one thing that, as I was working my way through this study, there was a sense of an official denominationalism. So there were the parochial schools, and the Anglicans didn't mix with the Roman Catholics in school. But day to day, in terms of neighbors and communities, there was a kind of informal mixing. So we had this denominational settlement, and it's sort of a big theme in Newfoundland history that's come across in writings. And I think it was significant. I mean, it was a big thing. But in terms of lived religious belief, the official kind of divides could be blurry on the ground and at the neighborhood level, definitely. And the schools were so important, like in that kind of modern late 1950s era, when we were seeing the need to like modernize schools and invest in schools, and women were often called on to support that. And they met in schools. So one of my images, the schoolhouse scrubbers, they were a group of women who were getting ready to scrub the St. Andrew's Schoolhouse in Seal Cove, where they met as a CWA.
So Vicki Hallett has a question. You can unmute yourself, Vicki.
Hello, Bonnie.
Hello, Vicki.
Hi.
Hi, look at you. I can see you. Hi.
It's so nice to
Look,
see
we have
faces.
twinsies offices.
I know. Thank you so much for being here tonight and doing this. We really appreciate it. I really enjoyed Ordinary Saints. And I had a question about a comment you made earlier that, you felt that these women had a kind of a feminist way of operating or a feminist theology, you know. But I'm interested, did you actually ask any of them or speak to them directly about feminism? Because you said you didn't think any of them would actually identify as feminists. So I'm curious if you ever had those conversations with anyone and how that went at all.
Yeah, I didn't, because I kind of knew.
Yeah.
As an insider, again, bringing that insider perspective, and you know, these are women who's like, oh, them bra burning, man hating stereotypes, you know, like every terrible stereotype of women who stand up for the rights and fight for the rights of other women. But boy, they lived it. I think that was what I found really interesting, is that every aspect of their lives, they'd have a meeting and the clergy would come in, the male clergy come in and tell them how it's going to be. And they'd be like, they'd listen carefully, and then they'd be like, fuck it, I'm going to do whatever I want, right? You know, they wouldn't say that, but they pretty much lived it, right? They said, yeah, nice, but yeah, we're going to do what's important to us. And I thought that was really important, really interesting, and just how they were in relate. And the sisters, I had always planned to write an essay called "From Sisters to Ladies" about this transition and delve into it deeper. It's like I have a whole chapter that didn't make it into Ordinary Saints called "Minute Book Theologians," about expressing understandings of relationships with the divine and with and personal relationships with the divine through being a secretary of a church association and speaking publicly in that role. It's still sitting in my laptop.
Well, when you write it, you'll come back and tell us about it. Eh?
Yeah, exactly. I know. There's only so much when I had so much material, as anyone who's written a dissertation knows. And Linda Keeley said, "This is going to be really long, Bonnie." And I'm like, okay, choices have to be made. And sort of focusing on that work cycle and different types of work became the organizing principle of the study. So your textiles, your food, your household labor, so that the caring, that became the focus, just to give it some arc of structure and story.
For sure. Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Rebecca Ralph says, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk and I loved reading the book. I am really interested in Anglicanism, and the Anglican women's history. I was especially interested in your comments about the ACW embracing modernizing following Confederation. Could you speak more about this?
Right. Yeah. So what I saw was, again, like I said, this culture of sisterhood, the sisters of the CWA, this culture of mutuality, this sense of relationship with each other. And then there's this decision that kind of came from on high that the CWA was backwards. There's a picture in the Newfoundland Churchman, as it became, of, you know, a picture of a group of women quilting. And this was from a Canadian church. With quilting is the type of activities that are obsolete with a modern church woman. And I'm like, so basically this was a decision, and in a way, the irony of it was often led by middle-class women, clergy wives, who understood themselves as actually advancing women's position, that their old way was not a modern way, it was a backwards way. Spending all your time, you know, in meetings, knitting and talking around the wood stove. That doesn't cut it anymore. You need to be working, supporting your parish, contributing financially. And the ACW became more of that model. It became more of a ladies' aid, which was what we saw in other jurisdictions much earlier on. And I think as part of that family economy transitioning to the wage economy, and women losing that sense of your work is important in one realm, how can we make it important and significant in another? And that transition, and they became the ladies of the ACW, and just a different sense of being what a modern church woman was. And she was family oriented. She was all about dainty desserts and graham cracker crumb desserts, not, soup made with the trot bone, the trotter of a cow at a time. So that transition, I think, went hand in hand with that modern push for modernization. And I think it is something worth studying. I think someone to sort of pick up where I led off and look at that ACW and how that emerged and women's understanding would be very valuable, and kind of round out what I was seeing, a kind of thin edge of the wedge, to bring that and see it develop more. I think that would be very interesting. I hope that answered your question, because I could rant all night about this.
And thanks. And then Margot Dooley asks, in looking at the early history of Pentecostalism and the Salvation Army in Newfoundland, one is struck by the number of women who join and assume positions of authority. Do you see this as an example of resistance to clerical patriarchy in existing denominations, or is something else at play?
I am going to say yes. I think that there was an opportunity for women, especially in early Pentecostalism and early Salvationism, that it was an opportunity for an official religious authority in the community. But I also think it was rooted in a kind of an already recognized that women could have authority, religious and spiritual authority. So, as I said, when I was doing the interviews and talked about things like and relationships and Pentecostalism came out, nobody batted an eyelash at women preachers and women being in leadership roles in Salvationism, in Pentecostalism. They just didn't like how excited they got when they were worshiping. That seemed unseemly. The embodied aspect of it seemed to bother, which is quite ironic for people who take the sacrament and that to ingest as a means of demonstrating a faithfulness. So I would say that yes, it was, but I also think it was a recognition that it already existed within communities in that kind of vernacular way, and it just was a new way of expressing it.
So that's, if anyone else has any questions.
I had a question, and when we did a couple of technical rehearsals, and the last one I asked the question that it seemed that the emphasis in the thesis was on birth and death and not that much on marriage. But then when I was looking through the book, I did notice chapter 4 that says, we had lots of trouble, mixed marriages, women's conversions, and religious experimentation. So it seemed like there was a significant amount of discussion about the effect of mixed marriages. So I was wondering if you had something to say about that.
Yeah, this was one that that was really when we were thinking about in terms of women's work and like the work of marriage, like we were saying earlier, to me it was like all the household labor stuff, that sort of came part and parcel. But mixed marriages, I think, were really it really spoke to why people got upset about them. Was not so much because of the spiritual aspect as a possible disruption of the household, the potential that there wouldn't be that kind of continuity within the household, and there was an official issue with it. So the case of Doris and Ray, for example. Like Ray was an Anglican who was a friend of this Roman Catholic family. He, him and Doris built this relationship. They wanted to get married, and it was the official church in a way that stood between them. It was official practices and denominationalism. but within families themselves, it was this worry, I think, when a woman, that personal spiritual beliefs didn't matter as much as the fact that the household was going to get disrupted. And that was, I think, a bigger part within the family. But again, I think that the idea of there was official barriers that were there for couples. But there was lots of, through the informant interviews, there were mixed marriages all over the place. I mean, most of the women said they had a sister, they had a child, themselves married someone of another tradition. So, so it didn't really matter when it came to true love.
I had another question, and that was more a comment, really. And the emphasis that you put on your the oral interviews, both the ones you conducted yourself and the ones that you studied at the Folklore Archive and perhaps elsewhere, the importance of both reading the transcript and listening to the tape. I remember transcribing a couple of tapes from an old piano teacher that I had, who was an immigrant from Germany, and I transcribed the tapes, but because of the rhythm of the language, and in part also people don't often speak in complete sentences; they speak in phrases. The pauses between phrases, or the pauses between sentences, and also the diction, how clearly they spoke, and how fast or how slow, and how thoughtful they appeared, as opposed to perhaps rattling off an answer. So much comes through in listening to the tape itself, and not to mention the corrections that inevitably happen when you read a transcript, and then you go back to the tape, and you see that the transcripts are never perfect. There are always errors, and that's true not only in folklore, but it's also true in court transcripts, which you think you'd be surprised to find, but it happens all the time. Mm. So I thought that was a terrific thing. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, and just an example that came to mind as you were speaking, I know there was a student paper, and it talked about like sort of school life in the olden days type of thing. And it said, every morning started with prayer. So, okay, as someone who's interested in religion, it's like, okay, so there was prayer in the morning. But then you listen to the transcript, and it's, it was some night. We had the Lord's Prayer. It was some nice, none of that now. So you got the fact that it was nice, and the sense of declension that came across that was not captured at all in the comment. There was prayer in school every morning. So again, listening to the original, you catch up on that kind of detail that doesn't always come across.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, well, listen, thank you very much, Bonnie Morgan. It's been a pleasure to hear you give your presentation and to learn more about the subject that you've covered. And it was a terrific title. Ordinary Saints is a marvelous title. You're going to sell thousands of copies.
I'll thank Carla Madden for that one at McGill Queen's University Press. We conspired on that. She gave me the options, and I picked the combination.
No, you did the right thing. It's a lovely title.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm sure everybody here, even though most people are on mute, will join me in thanking you for your presentation tonight. And we certainly look forward to hearing more from you in the future, both on this topic and any other topics. I'm not Bonnie, during one of our technical rehearsals, let me know some of the things that she's working on. I'm not going to disclose it. Often writers don't want anybody to say what they're currently writing about, but it's certainly going to be very exciting, and you can look forward to, I think, several more books from Bonnie Morgan, and you'll see how, then it will be delivered as clearly and as in a disciplined and yet an empathetic manner as she did with her subject tonight.